Welcome back. Thank you so very much for joining me for a new episode of TMT with Mike O'Reilly. I'm joined, very well appreciated, by Ed Bristois, the Vice President for International Trade at the Consumer Technology Association. Such a valuable role at CTA. Can you give me and our viewers an understanding of what CTA does and how it functions and how big it is?
Absolutely. We are an industry association, and so that means that we have members, and the members of the association are companies. We have over 1,300 member companies, 80% of which are small businesses and startups, and that's incredibly important for our worldview, for our ethos. We are, at our heart, an association that represents an industry that is all about innovation and technology, and technology is a force for good in this world. How
does someone become a member? Do they have, is my understanding you are either a U.S. headquartered company or have a significant presence in the United States and you can be headquartered elsewhere? Is that accurate?
So to be a member of CTA, you have to have North American presence.
Okay.
And that could be a facility, that could be an office, but yes, you have to have North American presence.
And how large is your staff? How big's your team?
It's a good question. I think we're somewhere between 150 and 200. I think we're moving up a little bit since the pandemic. That was a challenging year for us, but we are back at it. I mean, if you might know us by a different acronym, the CES. We own and produce and run CES. So if you think about CES, CTA is the owner of CES. We had over 140,000 people at CES this year, and the interesting part about that was that over 40% of that 140,000 were from outside the United States.
Can you frame the significance in terms of employment, productivity, labor, all the different benefits to consumers for the companies you represent? Mm-hmm. How do they play into the overall U.S. economy, and then more importantly, globally, since you deal with international trade?
So we look at our North American market, and we're a $505 billion industry in the United States, and we support over 18 million jobs in North America, and that's both direct and indirect jobs. So we have a significant influence on the economy, and consumers use our products on a day-to-day basis, and workers also use our products because consumers and workers are practically synonymous. So everybody uses technology in their lives, every household, and we feel very strongly about ensuring that we can bring the lowest cost, highest quality technology products to consumers and fighting for policy that supports that objective.
And how does the U.S. compare globally? How are we doing internationally as we rank the universe? This is one of the most compelling and productive sectors for the U.S. economy. How does that compare elsewise?
We're an incredibly innovative economy in the United States. We're deep capital markets. We have incredible access to research, to development, to academics. We have highly skilled workers. Much of the design of our products takes place in the United States. So these are like high quality jobs where people are exercising their creativity genes and coming up with incredible new products for use by people in the United States, but also around the world. A lot of the production of those products happens in other markets, but some of it does happen in the United States, particularly at the high end.
So it's very much a global offering in both the services and the product side of the equation. Is that fair?
That is completely fair. And what's interesting about that is you can not buy a product that doesn't have a service component to it now. The services and the products are all integrated. So when we use services, we're largely using services through our devices.
I mentioned on the introduction that you're in charge of international trade for CTAA. It seems a lot's happening on international trade as it relates to U.S. tech companies. Is that a fair assessment?
There's always something happening on trade, and it's usually in the headlines. I mean, ever since really if I go back, ever since 2015 when I think the environment around trade started to change with the pressure on the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, and as that headed into the general election in 2016, candidates said, well, we need to walk the United States out of TPP, and then the former president, when he became president, did that on day one. And then he enacted all these tariffs on steel and aluminum, then all the imports from China. And just 2 weeks ago, President Biden said he's going to enact more higher tariff rates on products coming from China. So these are all related to technology products to one degree or another. Now, there's some products that escape tariffs entirely because they're so consumer-facing and price-sensitive, but our industry is deeply impacted by trade. We are trade-sensitive. We exist in a global marketplace, and we cannot make everything here in the United States. We have to use our allies and trading partners to develop and produce products that are at a reasonable cost for consumers.
On the macro level, it seems that the tide has shifted away, in more of a negative approach policy-wise as it relates to U.S. tech companies. Is that a fair assessment as you look upon things?
I think it's an incomplete assessment, if you will. There's this notion, especially in politics and in the press, that it's just about big tech, right? What does that really mean in practice? That there's only a handful of companies that represent the technology industry, and that's completely wrong. It's false. Most companies in the technology sector are not the large technology companies that you think of. There are many, many companies that are large, that are small, that are medium-sized, and there's an incredible amount of startups in the United States. So a lot of that innovation and then employment happens throughout that ecosystem. And it's not just taking place in a handful of companies. And
let's get into some more specifics, if you can, on what's happened recently. I notion in the last many months we've been the critique of the U.S. Trade Representative and their approach towards certain policy positions and how they're going to treat things like data flows and data localization, and a couple, and coding, and how their position would be in terms of defending the historically U.S. centric positions. They have switched that viewpoint, and their justification was a little bit of interest. Maybe can you explain for our viewers what happened and why they did it? Or why they said they did it?
Why they said they did it anyway. It's harder to define why they're doing it. At the beginning of the Biden administration, the rules of the road on digital trade were, we think, very, very clear because they were negotiated into the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement and this agreement the United States has with Japan. And these rules largely are about non-discrimination. So you cannot prohibit cross-border data flows. You cannot require companies to locate their data in a particular market as a condition of market access. You can't, it's the same with source code. You can't force a company to transfer their source code in order to access that marketplace. So there are strong rules in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement and U.S.-Japan agreement along those lines. And over the course of time through the Biden administration, there was more pressure put on the Biden administration by some of its NGO allies and also some in the industry who wanted to walk back those particular rules, that they said they were giving the big tech companies too much market power. Well, we would disagree with that. We think those rules are absolutely essential for startups and small businesses, and those are the chief beneficiaries of those rules. And having served in the U.S. Trade Representative office, I could tell you that when those rules were drafted, it was the small businesses that we had in mind. It was not the big tech companies.
So you mentioned these two trade agreements that this is a key component of. What are the ramifications for switching policy positions and leaving U.S. companies, high and dry as they negotiate and enter markets, globally?
So where we're at right now is that the administration, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative in October, said they're going to withdraw their support for proposals on these types of provisions, on data localization requirements, on cross-border data flows, source code, non-discriminatory treatment of digital product, at these ongoing negotiations at the World Trade Organization on e-commerce. And since then, there have been they've been engaged in conversing with stakeholders in the United States. So the White House had a number of listening sessions with stakeholders. We were able to participate in one of those. There's ongoing debate, I think, across the interagency about what the right rules of the road should be on digital trade. The position of the U.S. Trade Representative is, well, because the Congress is coming up with new legislation, we had to take this pause. We needed to give the Congress and the administration more policy space to enact new measures, potentially even of a discriminatory nature. So we think that's the wrong stance, that you don't need to have this pause. You can continue to negotiate with our key trading partners and our allies, and to address those harmful, predatory, and discriminatory measures that we see, particularly in authoritarian states such as China and in Russia.
Congress debates lots of different ideas over a 2-year time frame, and some of them are good and some of them are bad, and most of them never see the light of day. How did the USTR give the prominence to say this is a pause because we think that something's going to happen in this space or should happen in this space?
It's not USTR's call to make. They're not dictating how Congress should legislate. The Congress can legislate on its own. They do that. In most Congresses, it's frequent. Sometimes, legislation happens quickly. Sometimes it happens more slowly. But in this instance, there was a lot of pushback from the Congress, bipartisan pushback from the Congress on what USTR decided to do back in October. And I think the level of concern has risen significantly since then, because it's become clear that USTR wasn't engaging in consultations effectively or robustly with the Congress, and they certainly weren't doing it with the interagency. I don't think that the other agencies had any influence on this USTR decision. So the Commerce Department or the State Department, or even in the White House, USTR seems to have done this on their own with some influence from the Federal Trade Commission and the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, and perhaps certain key offices for them anyway on the Hill, like the office of Senator Elizabeth Warren.
You highlighted a number of people that were supporting its position. Is it a chance that this had to come from the highest levels of the Biden administration, right? The USTR isn't Ambassador Tai didn't get to pick and choose this by herself. You highlighted other partners that she had to help form this. Do you not? Is there a chance that the Biden administration wasn't sure, and then that's how they pivoted to these listening sessions, or is it that it just happens to be they got a lot of pushback on their position?
It's not clear to us whether there was high-level buy-in from the White House on what USTR ultimately did in October. And USTR had taken a similar position in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations, where they also did not want to negotiate on these same provisions. But when it really came to head, it was in October at the WTO, and it was the call for policy space that USTR I think led us to be extremely concerned about this. And I'm not sure that the White House was either briefed on what USTR was doing, or they understood that there was going to be this kind of pushback and blowback from that decision.
Well, then maybe that gets me to my next question. We saw a different voice from the Department of State and Secretary Blinken in terms of how they've approached it. There's a recent new report a policy strategy they put forward, and let me quote from it. It says, the Department of State, working with other agencies, will continue to argue against data localization, network usage fees, digital service taxes, as well as other market access barriers that contribute to the perception of increased control, but in reality often can undermine growth and security objectives. Is this an administration that's fighting itself, or is this where the grown-up policymakers are putting the genie back in the bottle, and maybe a decision by USTR that wasn't as well thought out as some had thought?
Like, I read that exact same language, and I was so pleased to see it. It just brought a smile to my face, because it showed me that there are people in the U.S. government that are look at this the right way, as opposed to looking at it through the lens of protectionism or shielding the United States from international competition, that they say our interests are best served as a country if we address these harmful measures around the world. And that State Department statement that you read is a perfect encapsulation of what we should be doing proactively as opposed to in a defensive manner. And I think the USTR position is entirely defensive.
And do you think that have you gone and talked to the State Department since they put out this report and got an impression that they have a driver's seat in this administration, or are we going to have some tussle going forward?
I think in any administration, the departments have their own latitude to pursue their own initiatives and objectives. And this is a State Department strategy. I would say the Commerce Department has its own perspectives, and they often enact on them, and particularly in the area of data and cross-border data flows, the Commerce Department has a number of programs where the free flow of data is incredibly important for U.S. businesses, and they have to ensure that. And so I think USTR in this instance is the one that's on the island, not the rest of the administration.
Interesting. Okay. There has been this understanding, or maybe unspoken macro view, that this administration is negotiating internationally with foreign regulators and potentially seeking them to do some of the heavy lifting that it's not able to do for a number of different reasons. Are you seeing that happen, or where USTR or other agencies are negotiating with foreign regulators to have an outcome on the broader policy perspectives for how trade is going to happen globally, and doing things that it maybe couldn't achieve domestically?
It's very likely. If you look at how the Federal Trade Commission and Chairman Lena Khan have influenced the trade policy process, it tells me that they asked USTR to not address these barriers to trade in other markets, like in the EU, for example, the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, other EU measures related to the cloud. Those are measures that perhaps the Federal Trade Commission would like to impose itself, but can't. And there's evidence that the Federal Trade Commission and USTR have been talking with people in Brussels to say, yes, go ahead, we want you to do this. And I think in a different administration, there would be probably more concern about these measures because they are inherently discriminatory against U.S. companies. So the FTC position is that we want governments around the world to be able to discriminate against U.S. companies because the FTC feels that the market power of U.S. companies is the greater threat. And so they have this different view of competition policy compared to past administrations where bashing U.S. companies is their solution as opposed to fighting for U.S. companies and making them more competitive in global markets. It's a very twisted world compared to what we experienced in the past.
You mentioned you worked in the USTR office. Have you ever were you ever directed to have such a position against U.S. companies? Are there protections in U.S. law can they actively pursue the attack and attention of foreign regulators to U.S. companies? Is there protections in law to prevent that from happening, or should there be?
Look, it's unprecedented. I think there's a significant amount of concern that, in the Congress anyway, that the U.S. Trade Representative is not proactively fighting for U.S. companies the way it should and the way it's done in the past. And I think the foreign government counterparts of USTR are probably shocked when they hear that USTR won't fight for U.S. companies. It's not what they expect out of USTR. It's not how USTR operated when I was working there.
Do you believe, and in your current role, it seems that Congress is kind of stuck on trade, they aren't likely to advance legislation in the very narrow majorities that they have on aspects of certain trade, or even to influence the negotiations, or even conduct as much oversight as they once could over trade matters. Does the narrow Congress majorities really hamper the ability to make sure that the agencies and the administration aren't going off the deep end?
I think it's very difficult for any Congress with this type of very thin margin to enact trade legislation, period, because trade has become very politicized. Both parties have strong views on where our trade policy should go. Sometimes there's a bipartisan support for particular trade policies, like on digital trade. I think there's very strong bipartisan support for the robust provisions that were in the USMCA, for example. But on the other hand, you have a Congress that can't even agree on the extension of long-standing trade preferences programs that gives U.S. companies the ability to import products from developing countries into the United States without paying a tariff. So these programs were designed to help developing countries and help U.S. importers at the same time. The Generalized System of Preferences program is probably the best example here, and that's been expired for years, and Congress can't, for 2 Congresses in a row, actually might even be 3, have decided they're not in a position to renew this.
Is it a tough time to be a free trader in the U.S. right now? I mean, it seems to be trade policy perspectives are becoming more populist. And you mentioned tariffs increasing or likely to increase by either whoever wins in the fall election. It seems to be a very different trade perspective than we had for the last 50 years.
That's the perspective of the Biden administration, that they are trying to reorient trade policy based on their view of what happened over the last 50 years. I think there's a lot of people in industry and in the Congress and around the country that would disagree that trade has been uniquely just harmful to U.S. interests. As a matter of fact, trade has been beneficial for U.S. households because it's lowered the cost of goods. They don't spend as much on goods that they once did. They can allocate more of their scarce resources to other things that are good for their livelihoods. I think there is a strong bipartisan consensus that the United States does need to address harmful practices in China and other authoritarian states. That's utterly clear. How you go about doing that is another question. Where I think there's also consensus is that we should be engaging more on trade with our allies and negotiating trade agreements with our allies. And there's a lot of consternation about what a trade agreement should be, whether it should be a comprehensive free trade agreement or it should be something different from that, less than that, should it have a different form, like this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which isn't a full trade agreement, has no market access. But you've seen some signals coming out of the Congress that they want the United States to negotiate full free trade agreements with our allies, like with Taiwan, for example, or with the United Kingdom, with Kenya. There's been letters sent to the USTR that the United States should upgrade its existing relationship with Kenya from this strategic trade and investment partnership to a full free trade agreement. The United Kingdom would be a perfect trading partner. They're our closest ally. Japan, we don't even have a full free trade agreement with Japan. Why can't we do that? And there's so many other trading partners that would benefit from a national security standpoint and an economic security standpoint if they had a free trade agreement with the United States, particularly in Southeast Asia and increasingly in South America. So I think people need to be more open-minded about this. You can negotiate provisions in a free trade agreement that meet your objectives. It doesn't have to be a stagnant model over the course of time. It can be adaptable, but we need to have a forward-looking, robust trade policy as opposed to one that's just about defensiveness and isolation. And that's what we're getting today.
How does CTA advocate for its trade positions when it runs up against policies that may be troubling? How does it negotiate with both the Capitol and the administration? How are you? What tools are your resources? Do you have offices overseas, or do you rely on others and partnerships internationally? How does the CTA make sure that it protects its members' interests globally?
Look, our biggest resource is the CES. So people from all over the world come to the CES, and at the CES, we do talk extensively about the importance of trade and about the importance of negotiating more comprehensive trade approaches with U.S. allies and key trading partners. So we also work extensively with our industry allies across the tech sector and increasingly in other parts of the U.S. economy. So because tech touches on every single part of the U.S. economy, we all have an invested interest in these issues. And I think we are increasing our engagement with embassies here in Washington. We're trying to make more connections with the ministers that are responsible for technology and trade issues when they come to Washington or when they come to the CES. And this is a global world, and we have to be engaged in it globally.
Do you find, I remember going to CES a number of times, you almost get lost. It's so big. It's like going to the Library of Congress and looking for a book without a card kettle. I mean, it's so much it presents, and you can go in so many different directions depending on your interest. It is the one-stop shopping of all, both the technology and the policy. A wonderful opportunity. How do you exceed each other every year after year?
I've been to 3 CESs now, and I will tell you firsthand, there's no way I could possibly touch on every single part of CES. It's too vast. Not any one person can hit every single component of it. And for my team, I'm on the government affairs team. We have a part of CES, and there's many different parts. It's called the Innovation Policy Summit. And this is where we have many different policy conversations on trade, on artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, privacy, diversity. I mean, there's a huge range of issues that we discuss in that. And we're trying to build in a more global component to that as well. So we also have conversations that happen at our startup stage. For example, we did a program about 40 minutes long on supply chain diversification, where we had 2 ambassadors to the United States on it. A former USTR, Susan Schwab, was on that panel. We had the head of the European Innovation Council, and it was a great discussion about how startups can engage in supply chain diversification. So it's a very moment in time event where you can address many different things on substance, but also introduce people to the latest technologies.
Well, I can't thank you enough for being my guest. This has been very helpful and enlightening. We didn't even get to touch on some of the issues like privacy. We'll have to have you back and talk through some of those issues. I want to thank you for your hospitality and really appreciate your insight on these important issues.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Mike.
Appreciate it.